No matter how you move, get it done. No matter how you move, get it done. No matter how you move, get it done. No matter how you move, get it done.
Okay, people, so Naruto as Hokage, can it be said to a certain degree that essentially he is ultimately a failure within the role, considering the fact that the very beginning of Boruto starts off with, yet again, the leaf being under attack and essentially in total annihilation after what seemingly is events that led from Kawaki. Because one of the big things about that prelude that ultimately teases what's to come with Boruto is the fact that the leaf is destroyed once again. And I remember when we first got that impact of that first chapter of Boruto, besides the fact that everybody was like, oh my god, we're really going to the Momoshiki arc again, like why tease that and then go into that. But besides that, a lot of people were like, what the hell? The leaf is destroyed again? So essentially Naruto's time of peace, the peace that he was supposed to create, a la what Jiraiya wished for, ultimately doesn't happen. Like the eternal peace, so to speak, that Naruto was supposed to bring forth didn't come about. That's something definitely to keep in mind. Now, we gotta, in order to say, well, what is a failure of a Hokage, look at the Hokage and their ups and downs. Like, because at the end of the day, every Hokage before Naruto was far from perfect. In fact, some of them honestly are indeed failures. There's in fact only probably one or two that I would say ultimately you can't call them failures because of their run and ultimately their time in office, what was accomplished and how things went about. Now, so let's take it a little bit back to the very beginning with the first Hokage, Hashirama, and then we'll move forward. Because if we're keeping it 1,000, a lot of the events later on down the road in the actual story of Naruto and Boruto, but in particular when it comes to Hashirama within the Naruto story, yeah, it stems from Hashirama's era and the mistakes that he ultimately made. You could call it that he was kind-hearted, you could call it whatever you want, but ultimately Hashirama's mistake of not 100% being able to completely kill his friend Madara and even arguably nurturing him to the point to where he tried to betray him is something that you could throw in the argument, well, damn, Hashirama kind of failed because he cared so much about his friend. Now again, Hashirama did try his best, and to be fair, he did think at the very least that he killed Madara when he stabbed him in the back and all that jazz, which was so poetic, you know what I'm saying, just so poetic. He literally stabbed him in the back, but also figuratively Madara felt stabbed in the back. But because he failed to put the nail in the coffin and make sure Madara was dead, ultimately everything that ensues down the road with Tobi, aka Obito, Madara, and then Kaguya returning via Madara, the Zetsu, everything that happens majorly towards the end of Naruto that was building throughout the entirety of the story, because don't forget, Obito did a lot of really messed up things and manipulated things, and all sorts of chaos came from Obito, which stemmed from really Madara. Yeah, it's kind of partially fault due to Hashirama, but then you gotta look at, okay, Hashirama, he definitely had his faults. Like, he did set up the leaf, which is, holy cow, you know, there would be no Konoha, there would be no Hidden Leaf Village if it wasn't for Hashirama and Madara. We gotta, you know, Madara will always be like the Sasuke Hokage of the village, you know what I'm saying, regardless of what messed up stuff he did in the end. They both were kind of, you know, responsible for it, but nevertheless, if it wasn't for Hashirama, there would be, of course, no Hidden Leaf. And then the second Hokage incoming, Tobirama, which, again, arguably, he's responsible for a lot of stuff that happened with Madara, because, for starters, his prejudiced nature. I'll be honest with you, Tobirama, while I understand there was a method to the madness, because he looked at the Uchiha like, yo, we've seen time and time again, because of their Sharingan, because of when they get emotional, they turn into basically beasts, so to speak. We can't really trust them, but he used segregation and a prejudiced look at the Uchiha to back them into a corner. He inspired certain aspects of like Danzo's mentality that ultimately eventually leads to the annihilation of almost the entirety of the Uchiha clan. Now, while granted that seemingly helped the leaf not get slaughtered by the Uchiha because they were planning their own rebellion, but maybe they wouldn't have been planning their rebellion if it wasn't for the fact that they were all pushed to the edge of the village and they were treated like garbage and ultimately treated as if like, yeah, the redheaded stepsons of the Hidden Leaf. Maybe they wouldn't have gotten to that point if it wasn't stemming from Tobirama instilling these values, these terrible values, into people like Danzo. Like, he actually was one of the catalysts to make people feel a certain way within the Uchiha clan that, yo, we got no way out. We're gonna be oppressed forever if we don't make our move. So you gotta look at it as if, okay, for starters, Hashirama, he didn't finish the job when it came to Madara, and Tobirama, he oppressed these people so much that there was eventually ultimately a rebellion, and ultimately Itachi Uchiha had to do what he had to do because of, again, all of the infighting and everything that was set forth stemming again from Tobirama. So right there, I would argue that both of them, they failed very harshly in a lot of areas. They succeeded in a lot of things. Tobirama with that militant ideal that kind of probably helped to protect the Leaf in certain aspects, because like being hardened and having, again, you know, people in the shadows like Danzo does have its benefits that Tobirama inspired, and likewise with Hashirama just starting the village and kind of trying to instill a little bit of a pure heart, but ultimately they failed in certain areas, so they weren't perfect, I guess you could say. They had their faults, and ultimately the future of the Hidden Leaf was hanging in the balance due to some of their decisions, some of their actions, and especially, I don't know, Tobirama, I always looked at it as he tried his best in his own twisted way, but Tobirama was messed up, man. Like the prejudice stuff, I'm sorry, I can't dig it, I can't rock with it. He treated the Uchiha very, very harshly, and it led to their demise, and they were a part of the Hidden Leaf, so essentially you failed a part of the Hidden Leaf. Then incoming the third Hokage, Sarutobi, which he was kind of like somewhat of a blend of his previous masters, I guess you would say, Hashirama and Tobirama. He was instilled with a little bit of the harshness that he kind of ultimately let Danzo hold all the weight onto, with being like, you know, in the shadows and doing the dark things that needed to be done. But also he had a benevolent feel to him that a lot of people looked at him as like, yo, he was a good person. Now, looking at it through a microscope, a lot of people would say, well, at the very least, you could say that Sarutobi was a failure to Naruto in many ways, because why not tell the village like, yo, this kid is a really awesome kid, don't mess with him? Why not keep him close to you? Why keep him in a shed by himself somewhere? Like the way Sarutobi treated Naruto in retrospect, again, looking at it under a microscope, you were entrusted with this kid from the previous Kage, so alone already, you should have been able to be there and be the person that he needed so that he could have that warmth. Now granted, the story wouldn't have happened if he would have had the love and kindness from Sarutobi. If the Hidden Leaf Village would have loved him as a character, things wouldn't have happened. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, in particular, Sarutobi, the responsibilities that was left behind by somebody that died to protect the village and said, all I ask is, yo, raise my son, you know what I'm saying? Show him some love and kindness. And Sarutobi was like, oh, love and kindness, I got you, fam. I know exactly what y'all mean. I'm gonna put that motherfucking orphanage by himself, and ain't nobody gonna like that motherfucker. Yeah, Sarutobi, you failed in that aspect. But in terms of the Hidden Leaf, ultimately, there was some failures. I would say that Sarutobi, he took what his predecessors, again, had set forth, and he tried his damnedest. You can't really necessarily blame him for, like, Orochimaru. Like, granted, he was able to stop Orochimaru, and ultimately, since he stopped Orochimaru, nothing really stemming necessarily from Orochimaru was able to destroy the village. Like, he was, you know, tied to the Akatsuki at one given point, so you could say something with pain, but that's not really Sarutobi's fault. And ultimately, I wouldn't necessarily throw the blame entirely of Orochimaru on Sarutobi, because they were basically just trying to guide this lost kid in the right direction. How can you fault them for that? And on top of that, he gave his life to stop his rogue student, which essentially did. Like, it wasn't, you know, the end of the leaf due to anything with Sarutobi. He actually did the best he could, but in terms of just being the Hokage to everyone, I would say he failed with one person, again, Naruto. Like, that failure led to Naruto's success, but he still failed nonetheless when it came to that one child. Also, I would argue that he fostered the, I guess, shadow works of Danzo. He allowed things to go on. Like, Danzo should have died a long time ago, and a lot of that I feel as though it was due to Sarutobi's weakness. Sarutobi couldn't get the job done of getting rid of his former friend and ultimately standing up and saying, yo, enough is enough, because he knows realistically in a role such as Hokage, there are dark things in the shadows that you don't want to get your hands dirty with, because then ultimately you will be depraved as well. You will fall into depravity, so to speak, a la something like Magi, because then you'll start to go down a dark path. So a lot of that was due to Sarutobi's inability to walk that dark way, that he would throw the work on Danzo and let Danzo handle all the messed up stuff while he keeps the squeaky clean image and the golden heart, so to speak. So Sarutobi, he had his ways. I wouldn't say he was a failure. I say he did the best he could, but he did fail with one person. And I guess if you're looking at it from that aspect, he definitely failed with Naruto, and he also failed to kind kind of foster Danzo into a better direction, because Danzo always, you could argue, hated him. Like, he had respect for him and all that jazz, but he hated what he stood for, because he was more along the lines of like a Hashirama with a little bit of influence of Tobirama, while Danzo was straight up on some Tobirama stuff. And Danzo, you know, just quickly, even though he would have been like technically the 6th Hokage, he was like Hokage for 5 minutes and never officially inducted. So we're not gonna play like, yeah, Danzo as Hokage. He did nothing as Hokage, okay? He got his ass busted down as Hokage, so we're not gonna pretend Danzo was Hokage. I'm just saying. Then the 4th Hokage. Now, out of all of them, I would say this is the one that, can you really say he was a failure? Like, pretty much all of his life, which he died very young, obviously, you know, he was very young. He was probably, what, you'd argue maybe in his 30s or something like that, early 30s, when, you know, Naruto was born and he gave his life. Ultimately, he stopped the Nine-Tailed Fox from destroying the entirety of the village, actually putting his son into a bad situation, but there was a lot of a madness to the method of what happened with Naruto. But ultimately, he saved the Hidden Leaf in a heroic defeat. And this is kind of like going back to the idea of, if you do great things and if you die before you could start going down the path that people looking at you a certain way, you become a legend and nobody can really say anything. I'm gonna give you a prime example right now, like how hip-hop artists, like when they die early on, everybody praises them, but if that same artist would have went on to live for a long time, eventually the public would have turned their back. Like a lot of people say 50 Cent, if he would have died after Get Rich or Die Trying, everybody would have looked at him as like the greatest artist of all time. You can't tell me nothing about 50 Cent. But because he continued on and went a pop route with a massacre and so on and so forth, the public started to look at him in a different light and no longer regarded him as they once did when Get Rich or Die Trying came out. And I know it's crazy, I'm comparing 50 Cent to Minato Namikaze from Naruto, but just hear me out. Ultimately, because Minato, he had a short run, I guess you would say, as Hokage, and died in the most craziest but most epic and most courageous way you could possibly imagine, saving the Hidden Leaf from a giant fox, on top of that fighting some mysterious masked man. You could argue maybe he failed, I guess, to stop the masked man, but this was all a sudden moment. We got to put a little bit of nuance things in everything as well. We can't just say, oh well, he failed against the masked man, he's a failure of Hokage. No, if anything, out of the first 4 that I'm saying, he was the one with the least failures, and in fact the legend of the 4 of them. I mean, for crying out loud, throughout majority of Naruto, he was regarded as a legendary one. Of course, Kishimoto later on down the road decided to Deus Ex Machina stuff and make it, no, the actual strongest one of all time was Hashirama to begin with. In his DNA, Minato was actually just, you know, he was just regarded as legendary, so to speak. But yeah, I would argue in terms of his accomplishments versus his failures, Minato is probably the least on the failure side of thing amongst the 4. Then Tsunade, hands down, regardless of what you want to say, and I rocked with Tsunade. Obviously, she was the Hokage for all of Shippuden and a good chunk of what, towards the end of Naruto, I guess you would say, she became Hokage and whatnot. But ultimately, Tsunade as Hokage definitely failed very harshly. You could argue that she had the most of the brunt of everything, because a lot of the problems that came to her doorstep was stemming from the previous gens. But for crying out loud, Pain smashed the village to smithereens with everything that happened when the Nine-Tailed Fox was summoned into Konoha and was destroying shit. Minato made sure that the village, you know, survived from that, wasn't decimated or anything like that. Likewise, when Orochimaru came with his attack to the village, no, they were able to fend it off. When the Uchiha were attacking against Tobirama and Hashirama, no, they were able to get things done. Ultimately, Tsunade failed and Pain smashed the village, and everything in that whole aspect was Tsunade's fault, unfortunately. Like, in fact, it was her banking on a 15-year-old child, Naruto Uzumaki, to come and save the village when he went up against Pain and then ultimately lost his shit and stuff like that. Like, she failed in that aspect, and she failed yet again when Madara, the 4th Great Shinobi War, went down under her watch. A freaking alien from another planet came. Like, yes, she got the blunt of it all. She got the most harsh, I guess you could say, problems at her doorstep, but nevertheless, Tsunade failed. Like, hands down, she wasn't even the strongest in the freaking Hidden Leaf while she was Hokage. And again, I like Tsunade. I'm not trying to be biased against her, because she did accomplish in raising a lot of really strong shinobi. She did accomplish in having some of the most coolest fights, even though she got bodied against Madara alongside the other Kage. And make no mistake about it, they also had the highest problems during this era as well. Like, Madara Uchiha enhanced with strength is nothing like the Madara Uchiha that fought Hashirama back in the day. So we got to put things into perspective there as well. But then here's where it's a tricky situation, right? Because I'm saying that Tsunade, you know, basically was the biggest failure of all the Hokage up until that point. But then you come into Kakashi as the 6th Hokage, the one that we least get to see. I guess, well, technically the other ones were flashbacks. But in terms of during the course of Naruto and stuff, we really don't get to see much because, you know, original Naruto pretty much ends right around there. And then we fast forward to Boruto and he's no longer a Hokage. But you could argue he was the one with the least amount of failures. But also, how many big problems did he really have? Aside from the last Naruto the movie when Tsunade tried to do his thing and he got kind of rocked and bopped and out of here, Kakashi didn't really have that many problems come to his doorstep. So while he had, you know, the least probably amount of failures, if any failures that you could really pinpoint at all, ultimately, how many big wins and how many big problems did he have to face in office? That's like comparing it to a president where you had 8 years of nothing bad happening, and then the next president comes in and shit show just starts dropping at their doorstep, and yeah, they gotta face it head on. It's not that they're a failure because that shit show, you know, falls at their doorstep, but because it's not necessarily their problem. So it's like Kakashi had the easiest time in office, but ultimately he didn't really fail. So it's calling somebody a failure leading into, you know, the whole crux of this whole discussion and whatnot is very subjective when it comes to the Hokage seat, because they all faced different problems, different scenarios while in office. Now Naruto, I would argue that in terms of the problems that came to his doorstep during this run so far we've seen in Boruto up to the latest episode, for example, episode 224, 23, 24, you know what I'm saying. Naruto has addressed and saved the leaf from almost any type of disaster head on. When, you know, the Boruto Naruto the movie stuff, when they landed at his doorstep, Kinshiki and Momoshiki, he handled that. The leaf wasn't destroyed or anything like that. They went to a different dimension entirely and it was finished. Again, Boruto was like the nail in the coffin, but nevertheless Naruto was Hokage and ultimately it was solved. Then fast forward to when Ishiki Otsutsuki shows up again, the leaf wasn't flattened and he was in the hidden leaf at that. They made sure to take it to another dimension and boom, there was very few casualties in this whole battle. In fact, it was only Naruto that took an L within himself. The only question mark that you can throw in terms of whether or not Naruto fails as Hokage is the events of what is to come from that prelude that we had where Kawaki was fighting Boruto and the leaf looked like it was flattened and destroyed. If that was indeed due to Kawaki, if that destruction, if we wasn't misled and that destruction was due to somebody else and Kawaki is trying to send people away somewhere else because he's like, yo, it's over, the leaf is done, we cannot face these people, and it's not that Kawaki actually is responsible for the destruction, then you can't put that as an L against Naruto because we don't even know if he's Hokage at that point. For all we know, during that time skip, maybe Naruto decided, you know what, I lost Kurama, I ran my dream of being Hokage for a time period, and he passes it on to somebody else. Maybe during the time skip, who knows, when we cut to that new future or whatever, maybe Shikamaru is Hokage, maybe Konohamaru, not Konohamaru. If Konohamaru becomes Hokage at some given point, I'm gonna throw my laptop somewhere, I ain't gonna lie. No. But we don't even know exactly the particulars when it comes to that event, so we can't necessarily say that that's a failure on Naruto's part, because however, if it is that Kawaki is the one that destroyed that village, and you gotta argue that Naruto fostered this child and brought him up until this point and he went rogue and whatnot, then you could throw the argument, well, Naruto failed miserably because it was the kid that he actually saved that ultimately turned around and stabbed him in the back and destroyed the village. So that's the question mark right there on whether or not Naruto's a failure of a Hokage. As it stands right now, everything we've seen so far in the current timeline, present day, no, Naruto has actually succeeded and rose to the occasion arguably better than majority of his predecessors. It's just where we go from here, whether or not Naruto will be a failure of a Hokage. And just shout outs to all the Hokages. I ain't gonna lie, I had a real great time right now just talking about all this and reminiscing through the timeline of Naruto up until Boruto. Yeah, crazy stuff. Again, failure is subjective because they all had their own obstacles to overcome, and some of them overlapped with one another, the problems that they had to face, but at the very least, majority of them did the best they could, and at the very least so far, no Konohamaru as Hokage. But I'm curious what you guys think. Do you think that Naruto's a failure of a Hokage or will be a failure of a Hokage? Do you think that I was a little too harsh on some of the Hokage? Maybe more than others. Maybe you feel like some of them were the greatest Hokage and I was kind of underestimating them, underrating them, so to speak. And just your thoughts in general on what it is to be a success and a failure of a Hokage. Considering we only have, if you really think about it, a very small bar to gather of 7 people that had the job, not including Danzo's 5 seconds of fame. But we only had 7 people to do the job job. This is all we have to go off on, whether or not somebody's a success or a failure. And as it stands right now, at the very least, I can say Naruto Uzumaki has not failed yet. But that's all I have for this one. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you liked anything I had to say or enjoyed the video, drop me a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you want more from me, make sure to subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram. Hit that bell. And if you want to follow any of my other social media, links of course in the description below. I'm ForneverWorld, and as always, people, have an awesome day. And remember the golden rule: anime and manga for life. Bye. Have an awesome day. Peace in, and shout out to the Hokage, shout out to Naruto Uzumaki living his dream, even though it's still rocky, that time of peace. I don't know when it'll come. At the very least, Kakashi had a little bit of a time of peace, but yeah, maybe someday. Have an awesome one.
To find me.